Those of you that don't know me, my name is Lance Strate, and I'm a past president of the New York State Communication Association. And we've come here together here now to honor and remember one of NISKA's most beloved members, Neil Postman. I know that Neil would want you to drink and to eat, so please do that. On behalf of NISKA, I want to welcome Neil's family, his wife Shelley, his son Andrew, his daughter Maddie. Thank you for coming, and we're honored by your presence. I also want to express our gratitude to NISKA's Vice President, Ed Leonard, for making it possible for us to hold this memorial today. And I want to thank Paul Levinson, Chair of Fordham's Department of Communication and Media Studies, for sponsoring this memorial. And that means we have wine here so that we can drink to Neil's memory. And let me propose the first toast. To Neil Postman, his memory will live on. To Neil. And his memory will live on here at the New York State Communication Association. The NISKA Executive Council has approved a proposal that was made by Susan Drucker, and the proposal was that we initiate a Neil Postman Mentor Award. This award will memorialize the special relationship NISKA enjoyed with Neil, and also recognize the fact that a great many of his students were and are members of this organization. In fact, a few of us even were presidents of this organization, and those of us that were presidents who are Neil's students probably deserve an award for ourselves, because immediately after being elected, Neil would proceed to nudge us about how we should be running the organization. But instead, the award will work. The award will work with us it'll be starting next year, and the past presidents of NISKA will meet at the annual convention and select the winner of the award, which will be announced at that convention but presented at the following year's conference. So I want to thank Susan Drucker and my fellow executive council members for ensuring that Neil's memory will live on here at NISKA. Some of you that are here today were with us just a month and a half ago on September 4th, when we gathered together at a different event where we celebrated the 5th anniversary of the founding of the Media Ecology Association. And we had decided that the perfect way to mark that occasion was to honor Neil, the founder of the field of media ecology. And so I asked Michael Grabowski, who's up there with the camera now, and Margot Hardenberg if they would put together a short video that would be about the Media Ecology Association, about media ecology, and about Neil. And it was short notice, our resources were very limited, but they came through with a wonderful short video that was perfect for that occasion. It's not a memorial, it's a celebration, and it was put together for Neil and the MEA, so it's not just about Neil, but I want to show it to you because it includes footage of Neil from a variety of sources, some television appearances, some privately filmed interviews, excerpts from his keynote address at the first MEA convention. I also want to show it to you because this is what we shared with him just a few short weeks ago. Well, that was what we showed that evening, and there was a tremendous outpouring of emotion for Neil that evening as well. I think there was great sadness mixed with great joy, and just a feeling of being with him one more time and letting him know how much he meant to us. That evening was a gift, and now we gather here to remember Neil and to honor that memory. This is not the first memorial for Neil, nor will it be the last, for Neil touched so very many people in so many different situations and contexts that no single memorial will do. For myself, I don't know how I could ever say all that I can say or all that I need to say about Neil. I'm therefore tempted to take a page from Wittgenstein and conclude that the only alternative is to remain silent. And silence is a perfectly legitimate form of communication for a memorial. But just as nature abhors a vacuum, Neil abhorred silence. He loved talk. He even loved crazy talk and stupid talk, any kind of talk. And so, for you, Neil, I will talk. And moreover, this occasion demands that I talk about Neil Postman as a member, a supporter, a patron of the New York State Communication Association. Neil was a fixture here, fixture at our conferences during the 90s, and he was generally content to remain in the background, watch his students present papers, meet new people, and schmooze with just about everybody. But he also lent his stature to the organization, and people came to NISKA's conferences. Some people came here just to see him in this highly accessible setting. And he always was accessible and generous with his time. I should mention, though, that Neil gave 2 keynote addresses here. He published in NISKA's journals, and he took his place as one of the 4 original John F. Wilson Fellows, which was NISKA's highest honor. As chair of NYU's Department of Culture and Communication, he lent material and economic and personnel support to NISKA and encouraged his faculty and students to attend here and participate. And when NISKA ran into trouble, Neil was instrumental in saving our organization and helping to build it back up. Neil loved NISKA. He believed it was the ideal scale and setting for a professional interaction. I remember once talking to him about planning large-scale conferences, and he said to me, he said, "Lance, why do you think that bigger is always better?" And Neil truly believed that small is beautiful, and he truly thought that it was best to think globally but to act locally. Neil never forgot about NISKA, and we will never forget about him. And the funny thing is that Neil never considered himself to really be in the field of communication. And yet, he created a curriculum for the media ecology program that was deeply rooted in communication theory. I'm not just talking about media and technology here, but the study of language and semantics, of perception and social interaction, of relationships, information theory, cybernetics, systems theory. And all were essential components of the media ecology curriculum. We read the great books and studied the great ideas in communication. And numerous times I've heard outsiders in our field speak admiringly of the education that media ecology graduates received from Neil Postman. But beyond the content of his curriculum, Neil embodied communication. The Jesuits have an ideal about communication. They call it eloquentia perfecta, perfect eloquence. That was Neil. He was an extraordinary public speaker. He excelled at leading group discussions. He loved interpersonal conversation, and of course he was a brilliant writer. For those of us privileged to be his students, and I mean that both formally at NYU or informally here at NISKA, Neil taught us how to be better communicators. He taught us how to be better public speakers. And I must confess to you that he not only taught me how to give a speech, but he helped me to overcome my considerable shyness and apprehension about addressing a group of people. Neil taught us how to be better teachers. And here, too, I must say that Neil taught me how to teach. Neil taught us how to be better writers, better scholars, better thinkers. And through his generosity, humor, and openness, he taught us how to be better human beings. Neil believed that the most powerful form of communication is the question. He taught us how to ask questions. He never tried to force his answers on us. He wanted us to just understand that the questions we ask have much to do with the answers we get. And he wanted us to understand the differences between good questions and bad questions. A good question is one that opens up discussion and inquiry, and a bad question is one that closes them down. At Neil's funeral, his son Andrew delivered an extraordinary eulogy, one that also exemplified eloquentia perfecta. And in that eulogy, Andrew reminded us of one of Neil's favorite and best questions, one to be asked of any medium, technology, or innovation. The question is, to what problem is this a solution? And that's a wonderful condensation of the traditional criteria used in debate and argumentation. To what problem is this a solution? Well, the problem was that we needed to be better educated. We needed to be better teachers. We needed to be better communicators. The solution to that problem was Neil Postman. To Neil.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sal Fallica, and I am an adjunct assistant professor in the Media Ecology Master's Program at New York University. And before I make my remarks about NISKA's special friend, Neil Postman, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, the officers of the New York State Communication Association, who were flexible enough to allow some of us to spotlight and memorialize Neil Postman, our mentor, our colleague, and our friend. You know, Neil was extremely fond of NISKA and regularly attended this conference over the course of almost 3 decades. He addressed this conference as a keynote speaker, and when he didn't keynote or participate in a chairs panel, you could find him attending various student panels. His attendance and disposition at these student panels was something to behold. He was a generous listener, an engaging participant, and more than a few times did I see him ask that quirky question that helped enlighten the presenter as well as enable the audience to gain an insight into whatever was being discussed. A few years back, when I reminded him that the NISKA conference was coming up and ticked off the names of some of our graduate students who would be participating, he told me that he wasn't going to be able to make it. Of course, he assured me that he loved attending the conference and that he would come the next year. That year never came. Neil's reasons for loving this conference were probably as varied as the leaves that greeted us on the drive to this conference. But I also think some of the reasons he loved this conference are in this room tonight. For what did Neil see and what did he hear when he attended NISKA? He saw students and sometimes their teachers struggling with the complicated ideas of our time and our profession. He saw and heard the people in this room and in rooms like this room over the years, examining the contradictions of our culture, earnestly questioning the role of technology in the pursuit of human progress, describing how media made our lives less meaningful or more profound, more or less trivial, more or less substantial. Indeed, peruse through this weekend's NISKA's program. Students are exploring the symbolic uses of communication and the pedagogy of communication. Yesterday, there was a panel discussion on questioning our assumptions. A panel, had Neil been healthy, he almost certainly would have loved to participate in. He almost certainly would have attended the panel on reality television, and not only because these were some of his graduate students, but because he would have loved the topic, although I have the feeling he would have winced at the word hegemonic in the program title. In fact, that panel examined the reflection, in fact, the panel that examined the reflection, the concept of reflection in the electronic world could also be seen as a tribute to Neil's work, whose life was testimony to the powers of reflection in the onslaught of electronic clutter. Of course, the panel entitled The Wonderful World of Blogs, chaired by one of Neil's proteges and a world-class scholar in his own right, would have been met with something like this. Lance, what is a blog? What is so wonderful about them? And most certainly, something along the order of, Lance, the blog is the solution to what? Overwhelming question? My point in cataloging the topics in today's program is to highlight how these themes would have interested our friend and mentor, Neil Postman. The themes of Neil's work really concerned the future of our schools, the future of our political and social relationships in the face of our passion for all things technological, and the future of our children in a world brimming with trivial discourse. Yes, Neil Postman lived and worked for the future, and now he will have to live in the future of us all.
Hi, I'm Thom Gencarelli, past president of NISKA and a former student of Neil Postman. In coming up here, I'm completely breaking one of the cardinal rules of my professor, which is that I'm not coming up with my remarks written. And one of my excuses for that is the fact that I'm currently, while I'm here for the weekend, holed up in my hotel room without screaming children, trying to write a book chapter on Neil's work and thought for a book that Casey Lum is putting together. And I guess by saying that now publicly, I'm committed to finishing it. Of course, the terms have changed a bit since I was originally given the assignment by Casey some months back. I really just have three things I'd like to say up here. Really two, and then a brief story. One is that any remembrance of Neil, of course, has to include his great humor. And there are just dozens upon dozens of examples of things that he had said in my presence that I can remember just for how they, they lit up the moment. One in particular, just because I needed to choose one, is that I did a dissertation in media ecology on the subject of popular music. And a couple of my colleagues had, there's a page before the copyright page where you write a little sentence, if you can find one, a quote that sort of in a lighthearted way sums up exactly what you're trying to do between the covers. And I found a sentence from Aaron Copland. And he said, "If a literary man says two words about music, one of them is wrong." And I thought that was great. And I knew half of what I wrote was probably suspect. But I mentioned it to Neil. And without missing a beat, Neil turned to me and he said, "You tell Copland that if a musical man says two words about music, both of them are wrong." Two words about literature. Sorry. So much for writing down one's remarks. The other thing that I have to mention is that when we put together the 5th anniversary celebration of the Media Ecology Association, I wasn't able to attend because of a first night of a graduate class that I was teaching. And I had the plaque that we presented to Neil made up and met Lance outside of Fordham's Lincoln Center campus to give it to him right before the event was supposed to begin, and then hurried downtown. And when I met Lance, he was pretty calm, but basically was saying, I have no idea how this is going to go. We have no idea how many people are going to show up. There was no, sign-up sheet to give us any notion of how it was all going to pan out. And as I hurried away and he hurried back upstairs, I said to him, I'm going to call you tomorrow because I want to hear the results of how it all went. And I spoke to him the next day, and he said it was absolutely a smashing success. And we talked about that. But at the end of what he had to tell me, he said that he felt that that night might have been the last night that we ever saw Neil. And so I was thrilled that the event went as well as it did, but it was kind of a crushing moment for me in that I didn't make it and didn't at least have that one last moment. The story. Those of us who are here, Neil's students and friends, we tend to be involved in a lot of these professional associations and come to a lot of these conferences. And I think it's really just because well, part of it is that, we really like each other and like to be together and huddle together and think and talk about ideas and think again and spend some time. And so not only is it the New York State Communication Association, but it's also the Media Ecology Association and the New Jersey Communication Association. They're all sort of brethren organizations. And a number of us are very involved in all three. And the New Jersey Communication Association was created in 1997 by another 5 folks, at least 4 of whom are members of NISKA and past presidents of NISKA. 4. We held our first conference at my institution, Montclair State University. And our evening keynote address was Neil Postman. This was a one-day conference. And Neil was scheduled to speak at about 6 o'clock. It was in April. And sometime in the afternoon, somewhere around 3, the power went down across the entire campus and the surrounding area. And we had 2 sessions of about 4 or 5 panels each that were scheduled to go on. And of course, the keynote address and dinner. And we didn't know what the situation was in terms of the power outage. We found out little bits and pieces of information, just like we did with the blackout of a couple of months ago. But it soon became obvious that the power was not going to come back on. And as a matter of fact, it became painfully obvious that that was the case when the campus police came and threw us out of the student center on campus and told us that we could not continue our proceedings. And we're pretty belligerent about that also. Even in speaking to Neil, I tried to explain to them who he was, and they didn't care much. But what we wound up doing, what Neil suggested, is that I was allowed to go back into the student center to rescue the podium from the dining room. And we brought the podium out onto the steps of the student center. And the show went on. Neil spoke to the audience about technology and its pitfalls and the questions that we must ask in light of, or lack thereof, the failing of power on campus. And it was just a wonderfully eloquent moment. We have a picture of it on the New Jersey website of Neil talking to a collected, I guess there were probably only about 60 or 70 people left at that point. Everyone else said, "No, the heck with it," and went home. But standing outside in the fading sunlight of an April evening and talking to us all. And I think that moment just encapsulates a great chunk of what his career meant and a great chunk of what he had to say to us. My last name is Gencarelli, but I have to say at this point, l'chaim, to life.
My name is Paul Levinson, and I thought it would be refreshing to mention that I'm not a past president of NISKA. In fact, I've barely attended NISKA conferences. In fact, one of the few conferences that I attended was back maybe in 1997 or 1998 when Lance talked me into coming up here and presenting a paper about something. And my daughter Molly, who was then about 10 or 11 years old, thought it would be nice to come up and see the famous Catskills. This was held in Kutcher's. So I brought her along, and I'm sure Molly enjoyed my presentation and enjoyed meeting many people. But all she talked about on the way home was the 5-minute conversation she had had with Neil. And that made such an impression on her that when I told her that Neil had died, she actually, had tears in her eyes and said he was one of the nicest people I had ever talked to. And that was, over 5 years ago. I have lots of memories of Neil. He was my doctoral teacher at NYU from 1976 to 1979. I tried during that period of time to teach him the correct way to think about media. I thought he was far too pessimistic, but I failed utterly. Nonetheless, I think Neil did teach me how to teach. And so after the celebration in September, about a week after that, I got the page proofs to my next book on the cell phone, and I dedicated that book to Neil. And the dedication reads, "To Neil Postman, who taught me how to teach." And so I was glad to hear Lance say the same about how he felt about Neil, because I think that that was the most extraordinary thing about Neil among his many extraordinary gifts. One other thing about Neil, which was extraordinary for me in a personal way, goes back to sometime in the late 1970s when I went up to see Neil in his office in Shimkin Hall. Those of us who were Neil's students know what I'm talking about. Neil sat behind that desk. He held court there, talking about all kinds of things. Usually he was pretty chipper, but on this day when I went in to see him in his office, and I can't remember even what I was going in to see him about, Neil was poring over a manuscript, sort of wringing, his hands. Paul, he said to me, I can't make any sense of this. So I said, well, let me take a look at it. After all, I was, especially in those days, always glad to be the helpful student. And he gave me the manuscript. And I noticed something right away on the title page. It said H. Marshall McLuhan. And below that it said The Laws of the Media. And I said to Neil, well, this is a manuscript by Marshall McLuhan, which obviously he knew. And he said, yeah, I know, but I can't make much sense out of it. Which is not surprising, given Marshall McLuhan. A lot of people had trouble making sense out of McLuhan's work. Actually, Neil understood it better than most, among the best of all the people I've ever met. So I was never sure if he really didn't understand Marshall's work or was just sort of enjoying saying that to me. But anyway, I leafed through the manuscript, and it must have been a good day for me because it seemed pretty clear to me what the manuscript was talking about. And I won't bore you with McLuhan's Tetrad and Laws of the Media. So I said to Neil, hey, well, this makes sense to me. And Neil said, well, what does it say? So I told him. And Neil said, I tell you what, and I won't do the impersonation on this one because it's too long, but the gist of it is, Neil said to me, why don't you write up a little explanation of what this manuscript says? And I said to Neil, well, why would you want me to do that? And Neil said, well, it'll help us edit the manuscript. Neil, at that point, was editor of the journal, etc., the Journal of the International Society for General Semantics. So those of you who know me know I never turn down any invitation to write. Even if there's no money in it, it's so much fun thinking that someone else is going to read what I write. So I went home and I wrote up a little explanation. I dropped it off in Neil's mailbox the next day. And then about a week later when I went in to see Neil, Neil said to me, I heard from Marshall McLuhan about that manuscript. I said, good. Neil said, I sent up that little explanation that you wrote, and I asked McLuhan if he would feel okay about our publishing your little explanation as a preface to his article in our journal, because, you know, his article makes no sense. So, you know, as egotistical as I am and was, I saw my whole future in communications, you know, disappearing, you know, in a blaze of inglory, because here I was, an upstart graduate student, and Neil had done me the favor of sending up this little description that I wrote to Marshall McLuhan with the suggestion that it be published as an introduction to his, Marshall McLuhan's, article. But on the other hand, as worried as I was, remember I always like being published, so I said, okay, sure, go ahead and do that. Well, a couple of weeks later, McLuhan was in New York, and he asked Neil if we could get together for lunch. There's a lunch with Neil, Marshall, and me. Marshall was quite a character himself. The first thing he said to me is, you know, Paul, you understand really very little of my work, but you're too involved with the logic boys. That, by the way, for Marshall was an insult. You know, he didn't want people to be too logical. But apparently, McLuhan thought that I understood enough of his work that he consented to have that article published in the journal, etc. And looking back, you know, on my scholarly life, that was certainly the most important single thing that happened to me. Because it's extraordinary, you know, for a young scholar to have someone like McLuhan recognize your work, not to mention that Neil had faith enough in my work to create that situation. But that's the kind of person Neil was. I think that, you know, his generosity has affected everyone who was his student or who had anything to do with him. As Tom said and Lance said, I'm so happy that we at least had the time to see Neil in September. You know, as chair of the communications department, you know, I'm constantly getting requests, can I do this, fund that? And so when Lance suggested to me, I think on, you know, something like August 28th, Paul, would it be possible to have an event on September 4th at Fordham? You know, my first response was, well, you know, it's a little bit last-minute-ish, isn't it? But, you know, Lance is the kind of person who always pushes for these things in the face of what more reasonable people would do. And I'm often reminded of, you know, the famous line of George Bernard Shaw, that reasonable people adapt to their surroundings, but all progress in the world depends upon unreasonable people. So I think Marshall McLuhan was unreasonable. I think Lance was unreasonable. Neil was unreasonable. And because of that, all of these wonderful things have happened. So thank you very much for coming here. I'm sure Neil would have been very happy to see all of you.
Hi, my name is Sue Barnes. I'm at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And as I'm sitting here thinking about NISKA and Neil, I just have dozens and dozens of stories coming to mind. But a point that I'd like to make that I don't think anyone's really made yet is that, or not as clearly yet, that Neil really fostered a community of scholarship. I mean, we see that amongst ourselves who are students of his, and also of the people that encountered him at NISKA. When I was going down to the 5th anniversary birthday party, I announced to one of my graduate classes that I was going down to New York, and I had just come back from New York, and I had just come back, and I had been to a tribute for Neil Postman. And one of my students came up to me, and she said, "Do you know that he came up to me after a NISKA conference? He heard my paper, and he came up to me, and he told me how much he liked it." Neil was always doing this. I mean, he was at these conferences, he was attending the sessions, he was always trying to ask provocative questions. And I also remember a time when he and I were both doing a conference at Penn State, and it was like the conference weekend. The two of us were doing Penn State on Thursday and Friday, and then we were jumping in our cars and driving to NISKA for the rest of the weekend. And he really was committed to this organization, and he tried to foster scholarship on every level, not only with his own students, but with the other graduate students and other scholars that came to this conference, and he really tried to help develop this as a community. And I think in his honor, the best thing that we could all do is to try to help this organization continue to grow and prosper and try to show the same type of generosity that he had towards our students, towards other people's students as well. Thanks.
I'm Ben Sevitch of Central Connecticut State University. I believe that the first time that I heard Neil Postman speak, he was invited to our school, and it was about 20 years ago, and the only date and time that was available to us was Saturday afternoon. Now that's Death Valley, usually at a university, but I told my wife that I just had to listen to the man who wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death, and I didn't think it would be widely attended. Boy, was I wrong about that. For the benefit of the younger people in this room, Neil Postman was a basketball star. In fact, he may to this day hold the scoring record at his school, which is why the phrase is student athlete and not athlete student. The first time that I attended this conference, I think it was, and I brought my wife and I said, we have to listen to this man. I think there are very few professors that you could put in the category that this is the reason you attend a conference. And Neil Postman was in that elite circle, and I frequently would go to a convention because of the fact that he was on the program. I've been teaching public speaking every year since 1962. Now, Postman, of course, is famous as an educator, and he's written extensively on education and media ecology, and yet I can't think of anyone who put as much effort into public speaking as did Neil. There was no insignificant speech for that man, and his self-deprecating humor. I guess the last time I saw him was when the National Convention was in New York City. And he always liked to tell those deprecating but funny, cute stories about the interchanges between him and his graduate students. And I guess my lasting memory would be when he told the story of a graduate student coming in and saying, Dr. Postman, how come you don't use the word processor on the computer? And Neil said, well, I like to write my books longhand on yellow legal pads. And the graduate student says, but Dr. Postman, they have this program, it's called spell check. And Neil responded, I already know how to spell.
I'm Judy Iserlis, and unlike Paul, I was a president of NISKA, a past president. Anyway, I had a revelation before. Neil also taught me how to teach, although I was never one of his students. In 1972, as a young teacher, I was teaching at Montclair at the time, I read Teaching as a Subversive Activity. Are there other people who remember that? And it directed my entire career in teaching. It really did. So Neil also taught me how to teach. Although I was never one of his students, I knew him from here.
Hi, I'm Brian Cogan from Malloy College. I'm not now, nor have I been, a past president of NISKA. I am a card-carrying member, though. I worked for Neil, and I was his last official graduate student he finished a dissertation with. And there's so many Neil moments I could mention, but I thought because I did a fairly good Neil imitation, I would do it once for you. And that was when Giuliani, one moment just struck me, when Giuliani put a law together, the mayor of New York, that he would take the cars from drunk drivers, and Neil was the furthest thing from a drunk driver. Neil walks up to me very worried at a reception and says, "Brian, I'd like to have a glass of wine, but Giuliani's going to take my car," which I didn't think was going to happen. I had to say he was a wonderful teacher, a very charitable man, when I was very poor and broke, he hired me as his assistant, although I could not type, and neither could he, and we would sit and look at the computer and shrug. And for that, he paid me $1,000. And I just want to say, I have to apologize to Neil because I just bought this. But to Neil, I waited until after you were gone.
Hi, I'm Laura Tropp. I was also a doctoral student of Neil. And the first thing I remember him teaching me was, you know, the thing everyone's talked about. There's no such thing. I mean, the opposite. I always used to think, like every teacher had told you, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And I remember the first moment I heard Neil say, "Of course there are stupid questions, Laura." You know, I'm like, "Stupid questions?" And I'm thinking, well, you know, I don't think so. And he's like, "Let me give you a stupid question." I'm like, okay. And I remember it distinctly. He's like, and I can't imitate Neil, but he's like, a stupid question is, what language is better, French or Spanish? And I remember it just like kind of opened up my mind, you know? And then I remember my students that I'm teaching now said to me about a week after I went to his funeral, they said, "Laura, did you hear that, you know, Neil Postman died?" I was like, "Yes, I heard, and, you know, it's terrible." And they're like, "He's the one who said that there are stupid questions." You know? And I realized, like, you know, how much I started to realize how much I repeated the things he's taught me. And the second big thing he taught me was how not to give a speech. That was his favorite thing to do, which was to always sit, usually at NISKA, because NISKA was the place he always brought the grad students to come, because it was a safe and comfortable environment. And he'd sit in the back of the room and watch you speak. And then later he'd say, "Laura, come to my office tomorrow, and I'll tell you how you could speak better." And the first thing he taught me was always, you never get up and apologize for what you're about to say. And you don't realize how often you come up and you go, "You know, I had a late night last night, so, you know, I didn't get a chance to prepare." Or you say, "Well, I'm not the world's expert." And Neil was always like, "Well, why would you want to hear what someone had to say if you start by saying you shouldn't be up here in the first place?" So that was the next big thing. And then the final big thing I think he taught me was nepotism. Which is that you take care of your own. And if you know Neil, you know that if he knew you, he took care of you. And we've always done that, and the doctoral students, there's a whole bunch of them sitting at that table, know that if they ever need a teaching position, you know, you call me up and say, "Can I get an adjunct position?" I do it for you, and they do it for them. And that's when Neil taught you that, you know, he spoke at places that people hadn't heard of because people asked him to. And he was always, if he could do it for you, he would. And I think that's the thing I'll take away the most, that, you know, you have to help people, and that part of, you know, being a communication faculty member or professor is sharing, and it's helping. And that's what I remember most. Thank you.
Very briefly, Laura sort of inspired me to piggyback off of that last comment. Brian was fortunate enough to be the distinguished last student that Neil finished, and I wish I can say that Neil will have finished me as well. I'm the last student unfinished. But I am so grateful for the time that I did have him as my dissertation chair. But to piggyback off of Laura, Neil hated my topic, hated it. It's religion on the internet. He was like, this is ridiculous. No. just read my chapter and amusing ourselves to death, and no. But he never hesitated to act as my advocate and as my chair. He didn't give it a second thought. He said, "Of course, whatever you need." And I will be eternally grateful for that time that I had of his support. It really meant a lot. And I am honored I had the opportunity to speak on the panel at the MEA banquet a month ago, and I am honored to have had the opportunity to speak at that time. But yeah, nepotism.
My name's Gary Radford. I didn't know Neil much at all, really. I'm not one of Neil's students. I'm not one of Neil's colleagues. We must have had like 3 or 4 conversations with him. But for some reason, we ended up, my wife and Marie and I ended up at Neil's funeral. And so, and that says something that we heard about his death on the Tuesday. He died on the Sunday. We heard about his death on the Tuesday, and immediately we made the plans to go to Queens on Wednesday to be there. And it must take something quite special to do that, because, I mean, you have much longer memories of Neil than we do. But I guess one of the reasons for that is it all comes back to NISKA, of course. Our first NISKA conference was, I don't know, I think it was your conference. And we were very nervous because we were from New Jersey. And apparently it was, you know, it was not the thing to do to come to the New York State Communication Association if you were from New Jersey. This was probably quite a breakthrough at the time. And so we were quite nervous throughout that conference. And we did see Neil in his sweater and jean, sitting at the panels. And for some reason, I don't know how this happened, but we ended up at the gala dinner, or the Saturday evening dinner there at Neil's table. And there's me, Marie, there's Thom was on that table, Lance was on that table, Sue Jasko, Christine Nystrom, Paul Thaler. And for some reason, Neil did talk to us. We had the New Jersey Journal of Communication, which I hope you've picked up. He showed a great interest in that. I thought, why would Neil Postman be interested in the New Jersey Journal of Communication? But he took his subscription and took that every year since then. And the photographer came round to do the table shot. Remember the table shot? This is at Cush's, the other place. And he took a table shot. And as I say, it's Lance, Marie, Neil. And that picture hangs on my wall in my office. It's if you've ever seen Cool Hand Luke, when Luke escapes and a picture comes back to the prison. You familiar with this? And Luke is there with the two women with the big grin on his face. And that picture reminds me of this picture. It just holds so much, I don't know, sentiment. And then the other thing, and this is the last thing, to the New Jersey Communication Conference, and it may have been the same one where Neil gave the speech on the steps that Thom referred to, and that was quite a moment, and that really said something a lot about this man, who I thought, is obviously too grand to speak to people like me. He's come down to New Jersey, he's talking on the steps, and he was really a human being, a real person. But I gave a paper on Foucault, which apparently is a bad name around here. We did there's some kind of dialogue about this on the listserv, and we gave a panel at ECA on the F word, Foucault. So I was given this little thing about Foucault, and on education, no less, and Neil was in the audience. And I guess I should have known better, because I really tried to explain this in terms that people might understand. And I saw Neil. I was very nervous because Neil was there, and yeah, he's like nodding away, and I finished, and he's put his hand up. He said, this is all very well, isn't it, Gary? But you've got to admit it's all bullshit, isn't it? And I'm like, I said, well, you could look at it that way, I suppose. And for some reason, I did not take that as an insult or any kind of put down. I took it as a great compliment for some reason. Maybe he meant it as an insult, but he said it with such a kind of grin on his face. This is just bullshit, isn't it? That he would say that. It was in a public setting, and they would call my presentation bullshit in such esteemed company that it meant a lot to me. So he would say that. And so here I am talking about somebody I probably met. We probably had, how many conversations we had? Maybe 3, 4 conversations. But we went to his funeral. We're speaking tonight. One last thing, I guess, because we're past presidents, NISKA, Maria and I, and we did the conference. And I had this fantasy panel. And this was the Amused to Death album, which Neil's son at the eulogy mentioned this, that Roger Waters of Pink Floyd made a rock album called Amused to Death. Apparently Neil had no interest in or had no knowledge of, but was based on his book. And so I mentioned to Neil, I said, look, if we could get Roger Waters to NISKA, would you sit on this panel with Roger Waters and do this with me? He said, yeah. He said, sure, I don't know who he is, whatever, or whatever. He said he would. And so we had half of our dream panel. And we spent the next year trying to chase up Roger Waters. And we actually found the name of his manager in London through various means, but we couldn't get him. But that would have been a really neat panel. Roger Waters and Neil Postman talking about Amused to Death. But it never happened. But it's something you can play in your imagination, what that would have been. And it's quite a picture. But now we'll miss him. Thank you for letting me speak.
I'm Bill Phillips. I'm a doctoral student at NYU. And it's funny, when I was thinking about like whether I was going to speak or not, it was really kind of hard for me to make the decision because Neil's being and his passing were for me tremendously personal. And so I really kind of wondered, it's like, is it appropriate for me to say something, because I don't really feel I have anything really profound to say about who he was professionally and whatnot, because it seems so personal. Yet at the same time, I'm reminded of one of Neil's favorites, Aldous Huxley, who said that the way to get to the general is always through the specific. And so maybe, you know, some of these testimonies, which are so personal, I think do say something larger. I'm just remembering when I first met Neil, I was a master's student in the Department of Media Ecology, and I started getting interested in going further. And I remember mentioning it to him and saying, listen, could we talk sometime, because I'm interested in maybe applying to the doctoral program. And so we set up a time to meet, and it was around 11:30 or something like this. And so I showed up expecting to have a kind of a serious, you know, talk in the office. He says, you know, have you had lunch? And so we adjourned to Coppolino's. I don't know if any of you remember Coppolino's, kind of, let's call it a low-rent, interesting, ambient Italian restaurant around the corner from NYU. And I think we even had wine. And that was a paradigm shift for me. He took me so seriously and was there. I mean, all of these testimonies, I think, show the way in which Neil kind of reached out to you as a person, as a human being. And that had a tremendous impact on me. In fact, Brian and Sal and I and someone else, I think, were talking about the fund for Neil, the Neil Postman Fund at New York University. And we were saying perhaps the most fitting use of this money would be for it to be for, you know, professors to take students out for lunch with wine, because I think you get a connection there. You know, one of the tenets of media ecology, or certainly one of McLuhan's ideas, was the idea that different forms of media extended the senses in different ways. And as I've been thinking about Neil this afternoon, thinking about teaching and what we do, and really Neil was himself a great example of what he called the loving resistance fighter. I think it's in Technopoly he talks about that, you know, where you really, you're concerned with the way things are, but you critique and you deal with these problems in a loving way. I think Neil always had the light touch, and he had the humor, and I think that we can almost think of Neil kind of setting an example for us in terms of how a teaching career and a career of criticism can be an extension of the heart. And I think that's what he did so well for us. So, thanks.
I wasn't one of Neil's students, but I am the grandfather of many of you. When my students left Queens College and we screwed their heads up, we figured there was only one place to go. Let's have Neil Postman screw them up at NYU. And he did a wonderful job. I'm standing up here, probably now the oldest person in this room. And in a way, Neil's death does affect me. There are not many Neil Postmans in the world because he's a persona. He is a persona, he was a persona, and I think it's that kind of personality that becomes the true mentor. So all of you who were his students have a responsibility, and that is to screw up as many other people as you can and be a good mentor.
Well, when I met Neil Postman, he wasn't the Neil Postman. In fact, he wasn't even Neil Postman, he was Dr. Postman. And I was a young doctoral student at NYU. I had been accepted into the communications department. And I had done all of my coursework under Charles Seatman and George Gordon. And Seatman was in his 70s, and at the completion of all of my coursework, he retired. And George Gordon saw greener pastures at Hofstra University and left for there. And New York University, somehow in its wisdom, dissolved the communications department and told all of us, well, you'll be okay, you can go to this new department, which was, I was trying to recall the title before, it was called Educational Theater, English Education, Educational Theater, Speech, and Media Ecology. And there used to be a position in the Catholic Church before we canonized someone called the devil's advocate, which was to tell you why someone should not become a saint. And I met Neil Postman, and he was very young, and I was very young, and I was very afraid, and he was not very nice. I had never studied with him, and he had to kind of, you know, he was responsible for all of us leftovers who had been Seatman and George Gordon. And I persevered, and I have to say that the person who really pulled me through my dissertation was not in the department, but was Janice Gorn, who was in education administration and helped many people with their outline, dissertation outline. And everybody wanted her on their committee, and Janice took pity on some of us, and so she served on my committee and got me through. And I did get my doctorate from New York University. I was given a choice as to whether I wanted a doctorate in communications or media ecology. And since I realized that no one understood what media ecology meant, I took the doctorate in communications. And so why am I here? And it was because I am not a past president of NISKA, but I am a past executive secretary of NISKA for 6 years. And it was at NISKA that I finally came to know Neil as a person, and he came to know me. And while he probably did not have a lot of regard for my scholarship, he appreciated me as a person who loved NISKA and did work for NISKA. And most of all, had regard for me as a person. And so our relationship and our mutual respect evolved many years later at NISKA, and on a very personal level, not where it might have been. And so I have tremendously wonderful, warm feelings about Neil and as a person and what he's done for this organization and the role he's played in my life, although it wasn't back then. And so I'm happy to be here tonight to hear all these wonderful tributes and to salute him and have, at this point, nothing but the wonderful, warmest feelings and highest regard for him as a scholar and as a person.
I quit my job for Neil Postman. I was an undergraduate student in a film program at Ohio State, and one of my professors had probably illegally photocopied a chapter from Amusing Ourselves to Death. I read it like anything else I was assigned, and not a particularly good student. I was more interested in making films than actually reading anything. So a few years later, I was working at the NBC affiliate in Columbus, Ohio. And it was the O.J. Simpson chase. And we were there. I was the technical director that night, the video switcher, switching all the video feeds, and our news director was very excited and saying, you know, we're staying on with our newscast. We're going to follow this until it's resolved. And so I was switching up between the cameras in LA and our own anchors in Columbus talking about this. And we were in the air till about 2 in the morning. And I just thought to myself, why do viewers in Columbus, Ohio, need to see this chase? And then I recalled that chapter I had read in Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I have to say, it's probably the first time in my life I actually voluntarily read the rest of a book that I was assigned a chapter on. So needless to say, fast forward a few months later, I came to NYU as a master's student, quit my job, decided, you know, what's best to, if I'm going to make any product, to figure out, you know, what I'm making films about. And he was, as many of you other people here tonight have experienced, an incredible mentor, had incredible patience, and taught me how to be a better thinker. So while I have no hopes of ever achieving the level of clarity that he had, I'm thankful that he took the time to help me get a little bit better.
I just want to say one thing. You know, hearing all of this, it made me think of a conversation that Paul Levinson and I were having just last month, and we were talking about how we heard a bit of Neil in each other. You know, that is in some of what we said, some of what we wrote, that we could recognize, you know, a phrase here, you know, a term there, a bit of the manner. You know, that somehow it was in us and in others, like Sue Barnes, like so many of us here, that, you know, we can just see it. And, you know, in that sense, I think you know, there's a bit of Neil that lives on in all of us. And there's a lot of Neil that lives on right here. Thank you all. Thank you.